Hello and welcome to the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Our usual introduction aside, please be advised that the story our guest is about to tell talks about suicide. It's important to raise awareness, but if it's too much for you to listen to right now, please turn this episode off. If you need support, please speak to someone you trust or a professional. We will add links to groups that can help in our show notes. And with all of that being said, we will, as always, start with a story.
Good morning, Stefano. Interesting when you asked me to consider a story. I kind of thought, what am I going to talk about here other than what we're here to talk about today? And I think I kind of was reflecting a little bit on the use of social media and LinkedIn particularly, which is a platform that I've been very familiar with for some 10 or 15 years now, probably. But how there is so much in the press about the impact of social media, the negative impacts, and yet, this has been a platform, LinkedIn particularly, that has allowed me to connect with some incredible people, and in a world where we've all been isolated for so long during the pandemic. The ability to be able to connect and engage with people that you would never meet ever in your life, probably from all corners of the globe, for any of the flat Earth people out there. It's just a remarkable platform. And I think, nothing any more impactful than that was just kind of reflecting on the many people that I've met, particularly in the last couple of years, that I would consider kind of friends. We may never meet physically at all, but just this ability to be able to connect. There's a strong argument how meaningful some of those connections are, but I know some of them have been extremely so. My story is just one of sometimes, we don't really appreciate just some of the tools and the ability that we have to connect with people in ways that we would never have imagined, certainly in my early days, that's for sure. So there we are. There's my little thought for the day. So.
Thank you very much for your thought for the day, Steve. And there's a lot of truth to that. We wouldn't have met without LinkedIn, and this podcast episode wouldn't be happening without LinkedIn either. So, yes, completely agree with you there. Now, we will be finding out more about you, and we'll be finding out more about your story, why you were talking about LinkedIn, and how you can connect with people and overcome a difficulty in a few moments. But before we do that, let's have a quick introduction to the podcast.
You're listening to Storytelling with Puck, the podcast designed to show the power of stories in life and in business. Stories connect us on a deeper level, which is why we'll be sharing, chatting about, and feeling the impact they have on every one of us. Your host, Stefano, is the founder of Puck Creations, and we work with your business to define a clear, consistent, relevant brand which stands out from the crowd. We use that brand to create content that makes your audience think, feel, and take action. Visit puckcreations.com to find out more.
Before you do that, Steve Phillip, our guest for today, has been through something most of us cannot imagine. But as you can hear, he is still positive and likes to talk about the world around and everything that's going on, including LinkedIn. But sharing his story cannot be easy. Even listening to it sometimes isn't. But it's important that we do. So there's an important question that I think we all need to ask each other more often, and this is how I'm going to start today, as I believe we need to ask it again and again. So, Steve, how are you?
An interesting question, because this is a question, of course, I often speak to many organizations, many individuals and groups about a question that we ask without really thinking about it sometimes. How am I at this moment? In a good place, doing well. How am I at other moments during the day? Not quite so good. But it's a question that I think has taken on a new meaning, hasn't it, in the last few years, as we talk about mental health and well-being, having all been through some pretty challenging times with the pandemic, and of course now with all that's happening in the rest of the world, in Europe. How are we is a question we need to be asking with a little bit more consideration, and asking it more than once as well, I think is really, really important. But yep, right at this moment, pleased to be here and good to be talking with you, Stefano.
Well, it's good to have you here, and you're right. There's I think I heard somebody say, I can't remember what show it was on, but they were talking about asking the question, "How are you?" and following it up with "Really," because as you say, it's especially in British culture, I think, but in culture all across the world, we ask "How are you?" as just an extension of hello a lot of the time. Which is lovely to do, but
absolutely agree. We do it without thinking, and we're expecting a stock answer, a smile, and the word "fine," and then we move on to whatever it is we're really there to discover and discuss. So asking it twice, but asking how are you really doing is maybe likely to get a very different response much more frequently. So.
I think you're right. Now, some people may be questioning, if they don't know you yet, the reason that we have started on that note and what exactly it is that has encouraged us, I guess, to start this conversation. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, and if you don't mind, please tell us a little bit more about your son as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, for anyone who's seen me or can see me visually on today's podcast, I'm clearly not a millennial. I'm a man of some early 60s, let's say, who's had a career working predominantly in senior management in the automotive industry in the UK and North America. Moved into consultancy in the late 90s when I returned to the UK. Became a director of a leadership and management company, and then in around about 2008 decided to leave a fairly secure job and company car and all that went with it as a director to set up my own coaching practice. Not necessarily the best of timing, as it was the beginning of yet another recession. Unfortunately, that was more a coincidence than planning on my part. But it was at that time, actually, I was introduced to LinkedIn as a platform, not a social media user at all at that point. And I jokingly say that I kind of joined Facebook around the same time purely to stalk my children and see what they were up to. But that introduction to LinkedIn was fairly pivotal, because it led within 12 months to me recognizing the power of that platform to engage and connect with people. My coaching practice was very much around personal branding for individuals, how they would engage and communicate with others and to do business. And so began a journey with LinkedIn that saw me create a consultancy called Link to Success. For the next 11 years, worked with companies all through the UK and in Europe and overseas, from Harley Davidson to Toyota to the British Red Cross to all kinds of small to medium-sized businesses, business schools, law firms, accountancy practices, really showing them how to engage and connect and build meaningful relationships in business, with very much an end goal there of attracting more clients or meaningful connections of some kind. And in fact, I was delivering just such a workshop to a large automotive group in the Midlands in Solihull on December the 4th of 2019. And had a full day. That day was a Facebook workshop I was actually delivering. Used to look at all aspects of social media. And left that meeting to get into my car to drive around about 3.5 hours at rush hour back to Harrogate in North Yorkshire, where I live. And as I put my phone into the holder on the dashboard, I received an incoming call from Jordan's girlfriend, recognised her name appearing on the screen. And not unusual to receive a call from her, but not something that happened frequently. So, of course, I answered that phone in my usual kind of upbeat way. And then the next 2 minutes of my life got turned upside down as she through tears and distress, told me how she'd arrived at my son's house, Jordan's house, to discover he'd taken his own life. And at that moment, of course, the world just changes for you.
Of course. I could hear it in the way you spoke, and I felt it when you said the words, even though I knew they were coming. It doesn't matter, I imagine, how often you tell this story. It doesn't matter how often you're explaining what happened and going through your life. When you say those words, it's difficult, right?
Yeah, it is, because, I can talk about this, and I talk about this frequently. It's, very much part of my new life now, my journey, sharing this story. And there's a difference kind of talking about it, and there's a difference putting yourself back in that place, which happens for me. Sometimes it happens on these kind of interviews. It happens often in those quiet times that I have, and it's at those moments where the full impact kind of comes back and hits you squarely between the eyes when you say those words and really understand what they mean. Particularly because it was such a shock for us at the time.
So, firstly, thank you for telling the story, and for coming on the podcast and speaking about it. And secondly, I know this doesn't really mean very much, but I genuinely am so sorry for your loss.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes it feels like those words kind of float in the air, if that makes sense. But it's also a question of what else to say.
Mm.
Now, tell me a little bit more. You said you weren't ready, and it was a shock. So maybe guide me through a little bit more about what your life was like, what Jordan's life was like, and kind of the moments leading up to that happening, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. As I said, my career, a little bit about, as a family man, Jordan's mother and I separated and divorced in 2005, and very amicably so, and remain in contact and very, very close. Since that time, Jordan had a sister, an older sister, Danielle, who now works with me at the Jordan Legacy. And we were, very caring, loving kind of family. We all got on extremely, extremely well. We were all somewhat scattered around the country in latter years. As I mentioned, Jordan was 34 at the time he took his own life. He lived not too far away from me. As I mentioned, I'm in North Yorkshire. He was just over the border in West Yorkshire, in a suburb of Leeds. We didn't see each other every week, not necessarily even every month. He had his life as an adult.
Just sorry to interrupt. I mean, I'm 30. I'm 34, and so I think lots of people who are my age would almost certainly be thinking, well, yeah, of course you don't see your parents every week. That's a perfectly standard way of living. Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to let you continue.
No, not at all. But that is life, isn't it? And in terms of Jordan's career, he, if I start with the fact that he was diagnosed clinically with anxiety and depression back in 2015. But not necessarily. This was not the start of his journey with mental health at all. This was the time at which he finally, I think, recognised that he needed to speak to someone and go to the doctor. So we look back at his life and understand that he, had undoubtedly been struggling with his mental health probably for many years. And if you look back to someone's journey with mental health and look at the triggers and the events in their life, you will undoubtedly recognize probably pivotal moments that might have had an impact. But you also see behaviors and attitudes that once upon a time you might have thought, well, that's just Jordan. That's just a young man growing up as a teenager, being a little moody or struggling. And it's very easy for us to kind of put pieces of the jigsaw together that don't necessarily fit, but mm-hmm. also do help to build a bit of a picture that there's maybe been a journey here that started long before 2015. But in terms of his mental health, we look at Jordan as someone that once he was diagnosed with mental health had some initial therapy, some cognitive behavioral therapy. We didn't know the details of that therapy, what was discussed at the time. As I'll refer to shortly, perhaps we subsequently learned that information. But Jordan was a guy who, as a young man, he went and got a law degree at Northumbria University. He then traveled to the Far East on his own, just backpacked and off he went.
Wow.
He'd worked in London. He'd gone out to Dubai to work with a close friend at his law firm over there. In more recent years, he took a role with the immigration, with the Home Office as an Office of Immigration Officer. And in the last 2 or 3 years of his career was an officer with the Independent Office of Police Conduct. In Yorkshire. He had his own house. It was a second house now he'd bought. He had a great relationship with his partner, Charlotte. He had a little Mini Cooper that through an inheritance from an aunt who passed away, he named Olga. It was one of the old Mini Coopers. The 70s version, red with the white stripes, and and his beloved little cat Tabby, who he adopted from another family from his previous house with their permission, and had this incredible network of friends, that I got to learn more about subsequent to his death, really, that through university friends, through his friends in Leeds, where he lived, through his friends in Morecambe, where he was brought up before we all emigrated as a family to Canada in the early 90s. I mentioned I worked in North America earlier, where he was brought up, for several years and returned to the UK in 97 as a Canadian boy, he was someone that his friends would look to with some degree of envy, and he was allowed achieving all kinds of things. Also an extremely caring and considerate guy. He was the guy that his friends would come to if they were struggling. He'd think nothing of jumping in his car and driving a couple of 100 miles for a mate who was maybe, going through some tough times. And, I've heard stories of nights out in Newcastle with his mates where they'd look over their shoulder to see where Jordan was, only to find him bent down talking to a homeless guy on the street. And, so stories that make you very, very proud of who he was as a person. And yet, going back to his CBT therapy, one of the things that, of course, you have to go through when you lose someone to suicide is you've got to deal with their personal affairs. You've got to deal with everything. And part of that journey involved going back to Jordan's house, going into the attic and finding boxes of possessions that included partially completed journals from years gone by, that included those CBT therapy notes, to discover that your son was suffering from something called body dysmorphia, that we had no idea about, that he kept hidden from everybody, really, but to the extent that he couldn't pass mirrors and windows in streets and get changed in swimming bath changing rooms. And this was the source of his therapy at the time, and none of us had any idea. And then the journals, of course, that we read, they were not complete years, but there were periods of time from 2015. And, when you bring those journals home and we're all sitting here as a family, and then you read a line, from 2015 that says, I've been researching methods of suicide again today. I found this method, looks like an option, but difficult to get hold of. You go, wow. This journey for Jordan had been going on for such a long time, and yet none of us really had any idea at all.
The idea that he'd been thinking about the practicalities, the idea that he had been actually working out ways to go through with what he eventually went through with, but had, for one reason or another, not done it. I can imagine that seeing it afterwards must hit home.
Yeah, it does. It's an odd situation, really, Stefano, because you read that and it does help fill in part of the puzzle for you,
Right.
because you're always going to have that question when you lose somebody, particularly to suicide. I've heard the term used frequently. When you're bereaved by suicide, it's like grief with the volume turned up, because there are so many unanswered questions. There's the, as you said, what do people say, to you? There's so much going on that with any other form of illness, there are usually some answers or a reason that whether it's cancer or heart defect or a road traffic accident, as tragic as those are, and the grief is immense, that there is a reason why it happened. But with suicide, you're often left asking why. So in some ways, having that information was useful and helpful to answer some of those questions, really.
That's an interesting point, and I hadn't thought of it like that. I had, and I guess this is always what happens. When I knew I was going to be interviewing you, I had started to think about loss in my own life. I lost both of my parents, one when I was just 18, and one more recently. But both of those losses were to cancer, and as much as it still hurts, and it's just horrible even thinking about the fact that they're gone, and that some disease has come and got them from nowhere, if that makes sense. As you say, at least I had a sense of, okay, I knew this was going to happen. It happened, and of course I was grieving. I think you never stop grieving, but I did think when I knew I was going to speak to you, I was like, but it's different in some way. If you lose someone to suicide, and I think you've just explained it really well. So the idea of not knowing why is where the crux is of the extra grief, or the amplified grief, as I think you put it. So in some ways, being able to read those journals, in some ways being able to understand what he was going through, gave you a better understanding of why. I guess it never gives you a full understanding, because you can't be in his head, right?
Not at all. And there is always the questions, the burning questions that what could we have done to prevent that. I think everyone who loses someone to suicide will always ask those questions, despite the incredible amount of research and understanding that I now have 2 years on about this subject. You will still ask those questions and look at moments that might have contributed, or that we could have done this differently. You'll never lose that, despite the many well-meaning comments and messages I get whenever I talk about this, and people saying there's nothing you could have done, and I know we're going to talk about this today, but I'm very clear on my answer to that question is yes, there are things I could have done.
Actually, if you don't mind, let me maybe ask this, because it was a question I was going to come to, and so I didn't want to go down the road and say, look, there's nothing you could have done, because I know that sometimes, again, as much as I believe that, to you, as you just mentioned there, that can be like, well, you say, and that doesn't really make any difference to me. One thing I will say is, as far as I'm concerned, with suicide, there's nobody to blame. I don't think that blame should be apportioned in any way, shape, or form. However, potentially looking at it from more of an academic point of view and taking a step back, and that can be very hard to do. I read in, I think it was the LinkedIn article that you wrote fairly shortly after Jordan had committed suicide, and you said something along the lines of depression can't be reasoned with, and I thought that was really powerful. But then you also talk about the possibility of preventing suicide, and there's something you wrote, and I can't remember if this was in the same article or a different article, but there's something you wrote which you talked about. When you're committing suicide, what the majority of people, the researchers found out, is that people don't necessarily want to die. They want to escape something, and they want to escape intense mental and or physical pain, right? And so I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what are your ideas on some of the things we can do to prevent suicide? And related to that, almost the same question but asked in a different way, are there other ways to escape physical and mental pain?
Yeah, I can see how they're very much linked, those two questions. So, if it was within that article, and I'd have to go back to that article, again and see, particularly around the prevention of suicide, because at the time I wrote that article, that you're referring to, Stefano, that was just 3 weeks after I'd lost Jordan.
Yeah,
I openly admit to be somewhat embarrassed to say this in some ways, but it's why I do what I do now, is that if you ask me, what was your understanding of mental health, during Jordan's period of depression and up until the period he took his own life, and I will say it was a good solid 2 out of 10. That's where I was. I didn't really understand. I didn't know. And this is why I say, could I have done more? Because with better knowledge, there are things I would have done differently. There's absolutely no question. I'm talking from an academic point of view, practical point of view, not from an emotional point of view. So since that time, and I've consumed books, I've had meetings with leading experts, people like Professor Rory O'Connor from the Glasgow University here. I've come to have a much better understanding. But through all those conversations, the themes are very similar. And there is a common, almost mantra, if you like, that most suicides are preventable. So the important word there is most. Okay. Most suicides are preventable if we are, first of all, able to spot the early warning signs. That's, what is it I'm looking for? At the time, I didn't know what I should have been looking for. Okay. Right. And I now read messages from Jordan that we exchanged and think back to conversations. I now see the messages. I now see the words he was using and how common they are to a lot of the workshops that I deliver and the talks that I deliver around spotting the signs of poor mental health. So I see those now. At the time, I didn't do. So spotting the early warning signs is really, really important. The next step is really the intervention. How do we intervene if we do recognize those signs? And whether you're qualified or trained as a mental health first aider to do that, or whether we're just ordinary people on the street that kind of know what we're looking for now and have a little bit of training or a little bit of knowledge, all readily available online, often for free, to know how to open up that conversation. If we can just do that, and then if we can make sure that we not only have that kind of intervention, but that we are able to signpost and know what to do to kind of support people there. If we can do those, three things, learn how to spot the early signs, know how to step in and intervene in an appropriate way, and then know how to support and signpost people, we can do a tremendous amount. There's one thing I always add to those 3 points as well, is understanding how to support those that are bereaved to suicide as well. We know the statistics out there are that someone who is bereaved by suicide is 60% more at risk of taking their own lives as well. So I think it's important that we have those processes in place to support those who are struggling, but also those that are bereaved by suicide as well. So those are the kind of the 3 to 4 key areas that, if we all learn how to do that, we would save more lives. There's no question about that. I think it's important to say as well that we would save more lives at that moment, and hopefully ensure that didn't happen to those individuals again in the future. There is nothing to say that if I'd had that knowledge, I could possibly have prevented Jordan taking his own life on December the 4th of 2019. But there's nothing to say that he may not have continued on that journey unless he really had the continual appropriate interventions, beyond that point. And we know where there is regular support, which involves talking, it involves clinical support as well, then people can absolutely make a full recovery from this, can find the hope that they've lost again. The evidence is out there. Just one final point, coming back to what you mentioned before about people wanting to escape pain, if we look at the reasons why people choose to end their lives, they're always going to be very complex and very different for each person, but they all lead to a funnel, if you like, where most reach a point where they feel entrapped in some way in their life. That might be entrapped through a relationship, might be entrapped in their career, might be entrapped in finances, might be entrapped in poor mental health, might be entrapped in poor physical health. But such is the level of this entrapment and the pain, it's almost impossible for anyone not experiencing severe depression or anxiety to comprehend what that level of pain is like, which leads them to the only solution to remove that pain, and that is to end their lives. And at that point, they've gone from this sense of entrapment to a sense of complete hopelessness. And it's at that point that people move from suicidal thoughts to actually implementing a plan that they've probably been considering for some time.
Right. So linking everything you just said together, or trying to link everything you just said together, because then when you talk about the idea that you mentioned the only solution left is to take your own lives in their minds. But as you said earlier, if you have, as an outsider, if you maybe have a good understanding of some of the reasons and some of the interventions that you can make, if you have maybe some mental health first aid training, which I want to talk to you a little bit more about in a second, or if you, as you say, know just some of the basics that you might have read on an article on the internet, for example, in terms of how to talk to people, then maybe you can at least prolong something from happening. But you mentioned something in between all of this, and I think it was really key about the idea that, even if you'd known some of this information, and again, I don't think we should really talk too much or focus too much on Jordan particularly for this, because it then makes it sound like, again, the whole blame idea, and also you mentioned earlier on that you were embarrassed not to know more about mental health, to have a 2 out of 10 score. Personally, I think you have no reason to be embarrassed. I think actually society as a whole has a joint reason to be embarrassed that we don't know enough about it. But individually, I think there's no reason to be embarrassed because we don't, as a society, understand it. But the point I was coming to, is with all of this going on and with the potential to help people in the shorter term and kind of the first aid, the longer term help, the longer term support, the longer term talking, the longer term counselling, the stuff that you have mentioned, research states can genuinely bring people towards a full recovery. Is it easy enough to access, and is it good enough?
Okay, right. That's an interesting and somewhat complex to answer. So right now, I can tell you from my experience that we have kind of two systems out there. We have the NHS mental health services, from IAPT right through to the crisis side, and then we have the third sector, the charitable organisations, the community interest groups, and there are many of these, hundreds and hundreds of these around the country, from great organisations like Andy's Man's Club that's out there in the UK, just opened their 100th plus centre for men to come and talk, something born out of one group here in Yorkshire just a few years ago, to places like James's place, and I know the people there really well, and I noticed Prince William was there just recently, as they've opened a centre in London, having initially opened one in London. And these are places where people can go and stay, and particularly men who are struggling with their mental health. And Claire, the lady who founded James's Place, did so after losing her own son to suicide. And there are many of these, but there are challenges with accessing either the NHS side or the third sector. When you look at the NHS sector, we know we have an NHS that's in crisis and under huge pressure from a resource point of view. the mental health side is no different at all. It will not be unusual for you to be in a crisis situation to contact the NHS and being told that will not be a consult available for at least 6 weeks. And you'll be lucky if it's 6 weeks as well. So that doesn't matter whether you're a child, whether you're an adult. We then know from the many conversations I've had with people that have been through that system that the training in the main for people working in those mental health or even A&E situations when it comes to mental health is not up to scratch. Often the empathy is not there. You're talking about overworked, arguably underpaid people, trying to do the best, that have had the stuffing knocked out of them most times, dealing with someone who's maybe back for the second or third time saying, I'm thinking of taking my own life. And they're probably going, well, look, there's not a lot I can do here. And I have heard this on dozens of occasions, people being told that unless your son or your partner, whoever it is, attempts to take their own life, then there's nothing we can do. So until that moment that they undertake the act, there is nothing we can do. I've heard that countless times.
Sorry to interrupt, Steve. Just the idea of that, absolutely, it hurts my head. The idea that if someone attempts and isn't successful, then yeah, we'll give them help. Otherwise, they're gone. So at least that's one patient out of the system. And I know it's not that callous, but it sounds it.
Oh, but it almost is. The system is that callous. So this is not about blaming individuals here at all. This is endemic of a system issue here. That we know that people that are phoning up to as well to say I'm really worried, I'm feeling suicidal. I've heard those people being told, well, go and do some breathing exercises, go and put some music on, or and then kind of come back to us. It's absolutely mind-boggling. GPs, the best advice that will normally come in terms of what is the route if you're feeling suicidal or struggling with your mental health, what should you do? The best practice advice is always contact your GP first. So you will get an 8-minute appointment with a GP who has had a fraction of their 7-year training focused on mental health. Mm-hmm. And that GP will have to make a decision within that 8 minutes before their next patient what the best course of action is. Invariably, that will lead to a prescription for medication to help with depression, sleeping, or whatever it would be at that stage. And as in Jordan's case, here's a leaflet to a support group. We found that leaflet on...
It's just not enough.
Yeah, we found that leaflet on Jordan's kitchen table the following day. And I think, I look back to those moments walking into his... to his kitchen, see that leaflet and seeing a half-empty bowl of porridge on his table. And, those are the moments that kind of, really hit home to you that this death is so different to anything else that's out there. And, this is why I said I try not to let myself go to those specifics too frequently, because, it just brings it all back massively. But it's important because, those vivid descriptions, this is the reality. This is what, if you lose someone to suicide, this is what you're probably going to wake up to and face, I remember the police officer, who got to know really well leading the case, who said how much Jordan's suicide had impacted him more than anything. And he said, there was one thing I remember was walking into his house and hearing classic FM still playing on the radio in the background. He said, and we do this job.
It makes it, I guess, when he walked in there and heard that playing, makes it feel like life was normal, except for one major thing that wasn't. I guess is probably that.
But I think it was interesting, the choice of music. Jordan had a very eclectic taste of music, and that would not have been typically within his playlist at all. So I just thought it was interesting that but I know his girlfriend, Charlotte, had said actually classic FM was something we often put on a Sunday morning. We were in a quiet Sunday morning together. So, so these are the reality. This is the reality of suicide, really, and what happened. But just to add, I've kind of painted a picture of the issue with the clinical side. What is the issue with the third sector side? Well, if you're struggling with mental health, and probably go to Google or somewhere else, you're almost overwhelmed with the choice that's out there. And it isn't evident necessarily, unless you're of a state of mind that you're going to start putting very accurate keywords in to describe your symptoms and what you're going through, that you're going to get results.
Really struggling, you're probably not in that state of mind.
Yeah. You're likely to get something back that doesn't fit with your particular situation. And this is why I think there has to be so much more cohesion between the mental health services and the third sector, where there is a journey that anyone who's struggling with their mental health can go on that will lead them to the right solutions for them. Because at the moment, the system is broken. No question about that. It's fragmented, and kind of good luck to you if you're struggling or in crisis, that you'll find the absolute best route for you to go on that will help you find a solution to what you're going through, really.
We know this isn't an easy listen. Thank you for sticking with us to this point. Steve Phillip, our guest in this episode of the Storytelling with Puck podcast, is an incredible man. He's been through a lot, and he's trying to make sure less people have to go through what he has. Sharing his son's story is a big part of that. We're going to talk more about hope as the episode continues, and will direct you to more areas of support if you're struggling. For now, please seek help if you need it. For emergency support in the UK, go to giveusashout.org or call 116 123, which is the number of the Samaritans. There are many more areas of support at thejordanlegacy.com. Mental health challenges are wide and varied, but hopefully the Jordan Legacy can point you to the support you need. After this short break, we'll consider parity of health, we'll reach for a baton of hope, and we'll discover more about the Jordan Legacy. For now, let's hand you over to our friend and fellow storyteller, Andrew Thorpe.
We're all in the persuasion business, whether that's pitching to a potential client, selling ourselves in a job interview, or convincing a teenager to tidy their room. How we frame our message and how we deliver it makes all the difference. And this is the theme of my podcast, Leaning Forward. I'm Andrew Thorpe. I'm a speaker, a trainer, and a storyteller. And I'd love you to tune in to our latest episode.
I mean, you've got clearly a first-hand account of this, and I haven't, but I've heard from many other people sadly too many other people who have had first-hand accounts of this. And you're right, it is not necessarily even going as far as committing suicide, but different mental health struggles and people asking for mental health support and knowing they need support, and just not getting it, or as you say, getting something which doesn't fit their needs, or getting something which takes 6 weeks to 6 years before they actually have anything useful to support them. I heard there's an old saying, I think it's something along the lines of justice delayed is justice denied. I kind of feel like mental health care delayed is mental health care denied also.
I think, and just something to add to this, I mean, you shared the story of sadly losing both your parents to cancer, and one, your mother particularly at 18, and I know my wife will relate to that because she similarly lost her mother when she was 18 years old, and my wife's French, and at the time it just was in her first year of university here, and wasn't aware of how bad the situation was and couldn't get back in time because it happened very quickly. Okay. Now, 40 odd years later, she's still reliving that trauma. So, grief is grief. But the point I wanted to make was, if you're diagnosed with cancer, if you're diagnosed with heart problems, if you're diagnosed with diabetes, there will be an immediate process of treatment for you. No question about it. You won't be waiting, 6, 8, 10 weeks for this. You will be set on a course of treatment because of the importance and the life-threatening nature in a lot of cases of that illness. And yet when someone says, I'm considering taking my own life, so the threat is imminent, we don't do that in our healthcare system at all. And until we start treating mental health in the same way we do physical health, things are not going to change at all.
In a sense, as much as physical health and mental health, obviously they're all part of health, and we need to, in some ways, we need to make sure we think of them like that. I actually think that potentially what we almost need is we need a National Mental Health Service, and it's linked to the National Health Service. But the reason I say that is because people talk about, I think it's something along the lines of parity of health is what they call it. And physical health, it gets way more understanding, way more research. You've explained it better than I can already earlier in terms of the training, having 7 years training as a doctor with almost none of that being about mental health. And then the facilities that are set up, as you say, so we've got things in place in terms of third-party health services. But if you don't know where you're going, and that's a very simple step, that if you had some kind of national mental health service, or at least proper training for the people who are currently working in the current National Health Service, then at least that would be a start. And then you maybe find ways of integrating that into a broader service. So that's not really a question. That's just me ranting.
I mean, this, as you can imagine, this is a debate I'm involved with regularly, and the work we're doing through the Jordan Legacy is to move much more towards this parity of health, and most importantly, something that we refer to as a zero suicide society. Now, this was a term that I learned very early on in my journey as I started to meet and talk to people working in suicide prevention, and I became familiar with the zero suicide community, which is kind of an unregistered group of people that relate to some very high profile, very successful case studies that initially came out of Detroit with the Henry Ford clinics over there, where they put in place a very specific framework within the healthcare system that over a period between early 2000, I think 2004 to 2007, saw the number of suicides of people known to their mental health service and actually treated at the clinics fall from, I think the number was 7 or 8% to zero. It was an actual zero number for the first time ever. Yeah. So this is where the term zero suicide was coined. And then there are some very similar case studies of success through Merseycare here in the UK and in Australia and other centres. So, I very quickly became familiar with this healthcare framework, and in very basic terms, it is about ensuring that you have a really effective top-down strategy through government and the mental health services in any country, and that you also look at how you implement a ground-up strategy where you involve communities, the general public, workplaces, sports clubs, schools, all these, the digital community, for example, the built environment, who design bridges and buildings and car parks where people very sadly choose to end their own lives. If you can get a real understanding within those communities of what the issues are and how they can all be involved to one degree or another to prevent those, this is very much the work that we do now at the Jordan Legacy that I founded in officially in the October of 2020, but we got a website up and really started moving things along in the spring and summer of 2020.
Okay, actually, I wanted to ask you more about that, and we've talked a lot about all of the difficulties, the challenges, the problems with the NHS, etc. But the Jordan legacy, and also some of the other, the Zero Suicide and some of the other charities and foundations and ideas that you have mentioned, the community stuff coming ground up, are really powerful, and there are some huge positives and there are steps forward. Just the fact that we're talking about this kind of stuff on a podcast wouldn't have happened even, I don't even know, maybe 10 years ago, definitely not 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So there are positives and there are ways to look forward and ways we can help people. So, and we're talking about hope. So I wanted to mention something. I was looking through your profile and there was a post you put out the other day, and I won't lie, I was crying when I watched the video. But you showed a video of Harry Miller. And Harry Miller, I hope I've got his name correct, is a college
footballer, yeah,
in the US,
yeah,
and he was known for his ability. He was known for seemingly always being positive, but he became very, very close to taking his own life. But he got some support, and he now thinks he's on a journey to being better. And something he said, which I thought was so powerful, was hope is just pretending to believe in something until one day you don't have to pretend anymore. It relates to, in my mind, there's a whole business idea. People talk about fake it till you make it, which, to be honest, I absolutely hate as a business idea. But it comes back from before a business idea. It was a internal growth idea, which was actually about trying to give yourself a bit more confidence. And I think his saying relates to that a little bit. It's about, there is hope out there. You just have to pretend to believe in it, and then one day you will.
I think that's really important. I think there's a couple of points came out of that for me. I got goosebumps when you mentioned his comment again there, because and a couple of points. I always remember listening to the very well known kind of motivational guru, probably hates that term, Anthony Robbins. Used to be a big follower of his, and he talked about fear, FEAR, and he described that as false evidence appearing real. It's you're fearing something that isn't really probably going to happen in most cases. And hope is probably very similar in some ways, isn't it? Because hope is, I kind of hope this is going to work. I need hope, because at the moment I don't have anything tangible necessarily I can grip onto. But if I don't have hope, then I have nothing at all. So hope is, in a way, faking it till you make it. But I received a message or a comment on one of my posts the other day. I think it was a message actually as a result of the post, to say that, within his particular workplace at the moment, one of the office managers had done a motivational talk to the company. There were around about 600 employees on this talk. But he essentially said, essentially what you need to do each morning is get up and say, today's going to be a great day and I'm going to be okay. And if you start to struggle, just think kind of positive thoughts. He said it was literally that glib. He said, now, I struggle with my mental health, he said, and I actually went and complained and got told I was a troublemaker. So, we've got this situation where, that what is suicide prevention really about? Suicide prevention is about having hope, absolutely, but it is about practical actions. What are we doing practically to prevent a suicide from happening within our workplace or within our community or within the design out environment, all those places I mentioned before? Because let's come back to it's okay not to be okay. I was talking to a young lady yesterday who was told that so many times, and her response, because she was to the point of being suicidal, a lady I've known for some time, and she said, so what you're saying is it's okay for me to be like this then? Is that what you're saying? Because what we're missing is a really important addition to that statement. I understand why it's been used and it became one of these trendy hashtags, but it needs to be, it's okay not to be okay, but it's important you go and get help. Now, unfortunately, that's too long a hashtag for Twitter and anywhere else, but that's what it should say, because it is not okay not to be okay.
Yeah, I think, as you say, the meaning behind it is good, and I actually resonated with it in some ways when it did come out, because I think the idea is it's okay to talk about not being okay.
Yeah.
I think that's what it's supposed to mean.
And that hashtag, a variant on that came out, it's okay to talk. I thought that's really what we should be saying there. So, but as most things, these things get a bit lost in translation along the way, don't they? So.
They always do. Yeah. Again, as you say, people want to market it, and that's kind of my world in some ways. But but it can be done very badly, and people then go, well, how can we make this short enough so it keeps people's attention spans? And so they make a hashtag which doesn't fully encapsulate what they're trying to say. And again, the hashtag's fine if it's going with a post that explains what the hashtag means, but it's just the hashtag by itself doesn't, as you say, it can give the wrong message.
Yeah.
But in terms of the more positive messages and the positive things that we are able to do, tell us a little bit more about two things: the baton. Here's a hashtag: the baton of hope hashtag, and also the Jordan legacy.
Yeah, very much intertwined. The Jordan Legacy has been set up as at the moment, a community interest company, a CIC. We currently have a submission to move to full charitable status, but our goal is to do two things really: is to continue to raise awareness around the topic of suicide within those communities that I've talked about, and promote the zero suicide healthcare framework to those communities. We run workshops, deliver talks, we run many online panel discussions, and we go and work with organisations specifically to help them put in place more effective well-being and mental health cultures within their organisation. So all our focus is about not just talking about the issue and raise awareness, but what are the practical solutions? As part of that, we meet regularly with government and the Department of Health and Social Care, and we are a part of the process to help them with their long-term mental health and now suicide prevention plans as well. So we're actively involved in those discussions and working with them. But the Baton of Hope, which is not a Jordan Legacy specific project, because there are a couple of other stakeholders and people I know really well that together we kind of came up with the idea of the Baton of Hope. But the Baton of Hope really encapsulates probably everything we've talked about today, really, Stefano. So this is an event that will happen in the summer of 2023. I've just off a meeting yesterday with the organisation that's helping us put this together. We're not announcing it yet, but we've kind of got a 2-week period in mind now in July of 2023. And if you can imagine, cast your mind back to 9 years previous. In fact, at this stage, it'll be 13 years previous to 2012 and the London Olympics, London 2012, and the torch-bearing processions that took place all around the UK. We will be, in a sense, emulating that event at a national scale throughout Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England, where a baton or batons will travel the length and breadth of the country. There will be flagship events taking place at various locations throughout the UK. And we will be engaging with the whole population. So from the general public to workplaces, to the government, to the healthcare services and charities and the digital world, will all come together for a 2-week period where there will be events running in regions, through schools, through the education sector, evidence of where success is taking place to help prevent suicides, talks from people that have experienced it firsthand. There'll be music happening, there'll be celebrities involved. It is fast becoming the biggest event I'll ever be involved with in my lifetime. And we jokingly referred to kind of Live Aid yesterday, when there was talk about flying Phil Collins from one location to another. But It will be huge, and a tremendous amount of planning going on, and more official announcements in terms of how everyone can get involved. We're expecting by the end of June to be in a position to be able to do that June this year, but clearly quite a lot to organise. But importantly, it's called the Baton of Hope. We will see the baton carried most likely by those who've been bereaved by suicide in one way or another. But it's important. What is important to us is that this is not a fundraising exercise or anything like that. This is about opening up the conversation nationally about suicide in a way that's never been done before. It's been done in pockets before. You heard the great on the news just recently, Shining a Light project there through Andy Burnham and Sam Allardyce and the guys, Three Dads Walking and everything, fantastic initiatives. And we want to kind of take that kind of event and just make it a national, huge impact event over 2 weeks. But we want there to be a legacy from this, and built within the plans for the Baton of Hope will be, what does year 2 and 3 look like post the Baton of Hope event, the live event? And that is the kind of things we're working on right at the moment. What are the actions? What are the things we're going to expect people, the general public, to go away and do? And one of those examples might be that we know there's some excellent online training for free through some very reputable organizations that is accessible to any of us today. I've gone through it myself. Some of it takes 10 minutes to do. There's one that takes 20 minutes to do. There's a longer one. But, there's a 10-minute course that will give you that basic knowledge we talked about. If one of our goals and objectives or manifestos for the general public is, we want you to leave this event and go and sign up and take that 10-minute or 20-minute training. If we can see a surge in the number of people that are registered for that training, then we've achieved one of our goals. We've got the public to take action. Now, we will have manifestos for the education sector. We'll have manifestos for government. We'll have manifestos for workplaces, all with practical things that they can do. And this is what we believe will make the difference, that it's one thing to talk and raise awareness, and then everyone go back to their day jobs and their lives. It's a whole different event that leaves a legacy of actions that will help save lives. And that's really where we're going with the Baton of Hope next year.
So powerful, and I'm so grateful. I was going to say pleased, but grateful is a better word that you're doing it. It's going to make a difference. It's going to make a huge difference. Before I let you go, because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, and I know you have a lot of these interviews that you have to do. Can you maybe give people an idea of some places that they can go if they want to get a head start and they want to get some of this training now?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm going to direct you straight to the jordanlegacy.com website and the help menu that's there. And just briefly, the reason why that came about was that the article that you referred to right at the beginning of our conversation today, that I published 3 weeks after Jordan's death, was to share just the horror that we were going through, the absolute nightmare we were going through at that time, in the hope that someone who was considering taking their own lives would read it and not carry through with the act. And that did happen. And I received many, many messages from people. But what I also started to receive were messages globally from people that were struggling. And saw me, even at that early stage, as some kind of knowledgeable expert. I was far from it, and I'm still not an expert. I'm not a mental health professional at all. I'm just a grieving dad that now has a hell of a lot more knowledge than he did 2 years ago. But I realized that people were reaching out to me, and I had no means of signposting them. I didn't know where to send them to. So by understanding what are those steps, such as contact the GP or Samaritans or A&E, but then what? As I started to learn about all these organizations and we created the Jordan Legacy website, I wanted somewhere specific where people could see a list of drop-down menus. I'm struggling with my mental health. I'm feeling suicidal. I've lost someone. I've been bereaved to suicide. I have an eating disorder, whatever it might be. I'm being bullied. There is a drop-down menu for an extensive range of different mental health issues. We're going to have our website redeveloped very shortly, and that list will increase significantly. But on there are all the places such as Andy's Man's Club, such as the Hub of Hope, a local register that you can type your postcode in to find where the best services are for you. There are great sites like Ripple. I've come to know the young founder, Alice Hendy of Ripple Suicide Prevention. She lost her younger brother, Josh, just within the last 2 years to suicide. She's a digital cybersecurity expert, and she went into his computer and was horrified at the searches that he was doing to find methods of suicide, which he ultimately used. She has now created a web browser extension that's been lauded everywhere, that when you type in key search words such as "I'm looking to end my life" or "I want to kill myself," up will come a Ripple page with a countdown to allow you to breathe, first of all, and then a whole host of different resources, messages of hope that you can go to. Because I can tell you at the moment, if you enter those keywords into Google, until only a matter of a few months ago, all you would see at the top of the page would be the Samaritan's phone number, which, if you are in such a state that you can't speak to someone, is of no use to you whatsoever. But if you can, it's great. But it's in this one box area at the top of Google. Very recently, a second service was added called Shout, which is a text-based service. So those are the two services. The rest of that page will give you all the clear instructions you need on how to kill yourself and where those bridges are that you want to find. That's clearly not right. So, there's a tremendous amount of work to do. But yes, the Jordan Legacy website, jordanlegacy.com, we've got a whole host of resources to the types of services I've just mentioned. There are many, many more as well. And they're all people we know of and have spoken to and engaged with in one way or another. So
they're trustworthy.
Absolutely. They are people I'd refer my family or friends to as well.
Absolutely incredible. I think that's a really positive note to end on, and there are many positive notes to end on, but we also need to talk about stories that we've talked about today and the negatives so that we can get to the point of positives. And for that, I am eternally grateful for you for taking the time to come and speak to us today, and for sharing your story and for giving people that bit of hope. Steve, Philip, thank you so much.
No, thank you for inviting me, Stefan.
We will, as always, finish with a story.
From the beauty of the glen on a cold and misty morning, it'll shine from den to den, make you smile while you're still yawning. From the causeway of the giant to the port that held Titanic, it'll guide you through your trouble, it'll ease your sense of panic. From the valleys to the marshes, with a tear for our departed, it'll wipe away those tears, bring you close to all kind-hearted. For the meeting of the waters to the pebbles on the pier, it'll make us more aware, it'll kick us into gear. This baton of hope, this symbol of light, this torch is inside us. This flame is our fight. You've just been listening to an episode of the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Your support keeps our podcast going, so please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Subscribe to keep up to date with the latest episodes, and never forget the importance of sharing your stories.